America is a land of great museums, and every museum has spellbinding stories to tell.
I don't think a male artist would have painted this.
I think that it's just incredibly amazing that you can have all these women artists who've been working all these centuries and yet have them totally excised from the history books.
The National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. has a little something extra, a woman's touch. Next on Great Museums. Major funding for great museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.
Art is the great common denominator. It doesn't matter what your religion is, or your politics, or your color, or your views. Everybody can enjoy great art.
I think probably the largest misconception in reference to women in the arts is that, well, there are not a lot of women in the arts.
That there are no great women artists.
I would like to think that talent is dished out regardless of sex.
And in spite of the courses that I had taken in school in the established academic, well-respected academic institutions, I mean, I had not gotten really that information.
I'd studied history of art and never thought about it. Never was aware that women weren't included.
It's really astonishing that we never really knew about these artists.
So the feeling grew that here were these wonderful, wonderful women artists who had been successful in their day and were forgotten and ignored.
What we really show people here at the National Museum of Women in the Arts is that women have created for centuries and will continue to do so.
The National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. opened its doors to a curious public in April 1987. The brushstrokes on its earliest works were applied almost 500 years ago, and yet...
This painting is so alive. It has a great deal of vitality. The cat, even the fish that are dead, you can almost feel the scales of the fish. This painting is by Clara Peters. She was born in 1594. On a trip to Vienna, Austria, we saw the works of Clara Peters, and we saw her work again at the Prado.
As art collectors, Wilhelmina Holiday and her husband Wallace wanted to learn more.
When we came home, we opened our 8 source books, and we discovered there was no woman, not one woman. As a matter of fact, there was not one woman in the leading text in our country, Jansen's History of Art, until the year we opened. As a result of this, of course, even among very well-educated people in our country, they can't name 5 women artists. They don't know women artists because they weren't in the textbooks.
It was from this realization that the idea for a museum devoted exclusively to women's art was born. From the beginning, women had to struggle to develop their talents as artists. Often they were forced to work in isolation.
Women were denied the traditional means of artistic education that men were able to enjoy. Throughout history, most women learned if they had a father or an uncle who was an artist.
One of these women was Lavinia Fontana. In the late 1500s, masterpieces like this portrait of a young noblewoman established her as a successful portrait painter in her native city of Bologna.
This is a painting of a young woman, probably a bride. They married very young. She's probably about 15, 16 years old. And she's in the regalia that young brides wore.
The averted gaze, the lavish clothing and jewelry, and the loyal lapdog. These stylistic symbols of modesty, propriety, and fidelity exemplify her role as her husband's helpmate and property.
She did some monumental works. She had 11 children and supported them all with her art. She was the first, I suppose, truly professional woman artist. The Pope had her come and be the Vatican painter.
She was very well known in her day. She was written up by Malvasia, who saw her as one of the most prominent Bolognese painters of her day. But 100 years afterward, nobody knew her name.
This portrait of a noblewoman and her daughter was painted by a noblewoman, Sofonisba Anguissola.
Sofonisba Anguissola was the first woman of the Renaissance to be internationally known.
She triumphed first in Italy and later became court painter to King Philip II of Spain.
She's very good with children, but some of her greatest paintings were of her brothers and sisters. Charming work, charming. The little dog is the dog you'll see in many, many, many Renaissance paintings because it was the dog of the day for the royal families and so forth.
Elisabetta Sirani, born in 1638, was a living legend.
People came from all over Europe to watch her paint. Most Madonna and Childs are pretty stilted and stereotyped. This particular painting has great sensitivity. You can see the way the mother is looking at the child and the baby is looking up at her. When she died, there was a huge processional throughout the city to the gravesite. So she was revered and she was admired in her day.
In Northern Europe, women were also breaking through as artists.
Maria Sibylla Merian is one of the more interesting women artists in history. A 17th century person who really was as important to natural history as she was to artistic history.
And she went to South America in the 1600s, 100 years before Darwin, to record botanical and zoological specimens. You can imagine traveling in the 1600s to Suriname.
Her father was an engraver and her stepfather a flower painter, but her interest in science was her own. According to her German biographer, she liked to paint flowers, fruits, worms, flies, mosquitoes, spiders, and other filth. She used her paintings to illustrate her research.
We have 78 of these very, very beautiful hand-colored engravings.
She really is credited with the discovery of the life cycle, the metamorphosis of insects. Up until that time, people had thought they sort of sprang from the dirt, fully formed. What was really groundbreaking, though, is the fact that she depicted them so absolutely beautifully, and she depicted them in their most natural setting.
This same technique was adopted by the great American naturalist John James Audubon.
So many people, for example, have heard of John James Audubon, who lived, more than 200 years after Maria Sibylla Merian, but we know nothing of Maria Sibylla Merian.
It's just incredibly amazing that you can have all these women artists who've been working all these centuries and yet have them totally excised from the history books.
Our museum now is the only institution in the world doing archival work on women artists. If a scholar or a student wants to write on the subject, they almost have to come to us.
One of the first countries where a woman could play a decisive role, both as artist and patron of the arts, was 18th century France. Women like Madame Geoffrin held weekly salons.
18th century French art is beautiful. There's no doubt about it.
The 18th century was l'âge féminin. It was the age when women really were at the top of their game, because there are these very powerful women who are sort of the underpinnings of the political spectrum.
In 1778, the most powerful of those women, Queen Marie Antoinette, commissioned a young artist named Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun to paint portraits of the royal family. With the Queen's support, she went on to become one of the first women admitted to the prestigious Royal Academy. The daughter of a minor portrait painter and a hairdresser, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun learned her craft from her father. By the time he died, when she was 15, she was able to support her family by painting.
Well, her story is dramatic, it really is. She was very, very beautiful and extremely popular at the court and sought after. But when the French Revolution occurred, because she was a royalist, she had to flee.
And therefore traveled all around many other countries in Europe, Italy and Russia, just to name a few, and basically painted nobility throughout Europe.
We have her sketchbook from St. Petersburg here with 38 hand-colored sketches. And in the very front of the sketchbook, in her own handwriting, Elizabeth Vigée de Brun kept a record of her sitters. Then she, I suppose, just couldn't resist, so in spite of the fact that they were pencil sketches, she tinted some of them. She's an artist that obviously wanted everything to be beautiful, so it's a treasure to have the sketchbook. This particular painting was of a Polish noblewoman. Every painting I've ever seen of hers has had a wonderful mixture of color. There's always sort of a flowing fluidity to the fabrics. There's nothing harsh about Elizabeth Vigée de Brun.
Not even her painting of a boy with a gun.
Here too, the gentleness of the little hand and the wonderful ruffle around the collar. Apparently, even then, little boys loved guns.
Another portrait painter of the time, with less aristocratic connections, was Adelaide Labille-Guiard. Her sympathies often lay with the revolutionaries, and she worked hard to promote women artists. She too was elected to the Royal Academy.
Elizabeth Vigée de Brun and actually Adelaide Labille-Guiard were the only two women who had been admitted to the Academy, which then, of course, staged the various salons where paintings could be shown and therefore bought.
This portrait of hers is believed to be the wife of the American Revolutionary War hero, Lafayette. Across the English Channel, another emerging artist was making a name for herself.
Angelica Kauffman was once again quite remarkable 18th century Swiss-born painter, but someone who really did most of her work in England.
She was a founding member of the Royal Academy of Art in 1768.
Because she was a woman, they wouldn't hang her work, but they put a portrait of her in the foyer so that she could receive part of the credit.
Angelica Kauffman was, she aspired to what was considered by society the highest level of painting. Multifigural scenes or history paintings or allegorical paintings, but of course the market, particularly in England, was for portraits. So how did she get around this? With the museum's portrait, The Family of the Earl of Gower, she put them in a classical setting. So family members almost assume an allegorical sense.
A century later, women artists would portray such family scenes in a radically different manner.
I don't think a male artist would have painted this. I think when a man, maybe quite naturally, when a man paints a woman, there's always a bit of erotica in it, a bit of sexual. There's no erotica whatsoever.
It is an excellent example of how a woman's touch and a woman artist's touch changes the way in which we think about a particular activity.
Suzanne Valadon was a child almost of the streets.
We have one of the great paintings of hers called The Abandoned Doll.
It shows this young girl coming into womanhood and developing a sense of vanity and ego and awareness of her body and her beauty. And it's kind of an awakening of something within herself. The mother's face is a little sad to see that this is happening, and childish things have been thrown away. And here's the doll.
And Valadon, of all people, having lived on her own since the age of 14 or 16, knew exactly what all of that meant.
Her mother was a prostitute. She was a circus child and performed in the circus. And she eventually fell and was no longer able to perform, and she became a model.
Suzanne Valadon actually for a long time was thought of more as an artist's model and a bohemian than she was thought of an artist. She modeled for everyone from Renoir to Picasso, but she also painted herself.
They recognized her own talent. She was picking up brushes and painting, and encouraged her. She eventually had a son, illegitimate son named Utrio, and she taught him to paint. He became far more famous than she.
But Valadon, his mother, is really, I think, the greater artist.
Camille Claudel was a tremendously talented and tragic figure in the history of art.
Camille was a great sculptor, wonderfully talented from the time she was very young.
She, too, was overshadowed by the man in her life, her lover, Rodin.
She was a collaborator of Auguste Rodin and really his muse. But she was very much his collaborator as well.
Chaperoned by her family, she went to Paris to study art. There she met Rodin. She was 19, he was 43. Their relationship lasted 15 years.
You see, particularly in her early work, some of this very tactile quality that actually is interesting, I think we often associate with Rodin.
If you know his work very, very well, you can tell that she worked on his work.
Doing hands, feet, some of the most sensitive and difficult aspects of the human anatomy in terms of sculpting.
But Rodin refused to marry Claudel.
She left him and had a nervous breakdown. Her family put her in an asylum because they were terribly embarrassed by her lifestyle. She eventually died there.
The museum, about a year after its opening, had an exhibition of her work that was really groundbreaking.
And it was the first time her work had ever been shown in any substantial way. So I shall remember Camille Claudel with great gratitude for that, if not for many other reasons.
In America, aspiring women artists were taking notice of the bold steps being made by their counterparts in Europe. Some, like Mary Cassatt, even set out to join them.
Mary Cassatt is probably the best-known American woman painter of the 19th century. And the bath, which is a lovely aqua tint and etching, it's a mother bathing her child.
Well, Mary Cassatt is one of the few American women who defied custom and said, I am going to be a professional woman artist.
It's really amazing to me that an American woman from Philadelphia, from a fairly prestigious family in Philadelphia, was actually able to go to France and become a part of the Impressionist circle. Most of the other Impressionists, in fact, I think all the other Impressionists who we recall almost regularly, are all French.
She became greatly admired by the French and was given their highest honor. But when she returned to America, the newspaper said, Miss Cassatt has returned to visit her family with her little Pekingese dog. And she is the sister of, because her brother was big in railroad circles or something. So it took us a long time to appreciate our own Mary Cassatt as an American artist.
Another American artist who made the pilgrimage to the home of Impressionism was Lilla Cabot Perry.
Lilla Cabot Perry was pretty avant-garde for her day. For 10 years, she went over to Giverny and worked with Monet.
She's an example of an artist who was forgotten almost immediately upon her death and written out, not ever talked about in history books. She's become very well known as one of the American Impressionists.
We selected this picture as the logo of our museum because everybody seemed to love this picture.
During the early efforts to establish the museum, many critics couldn't see the need to separate women's art into its own museum.
And I could certainly understand that, except they were separated. They weren't included. And they weren't going to be included unless something was, a heightening of the awareness occurred. Until we opened, there were hardly ever any exhibitions of women artists. Less than 2% of all the paintings in museums were by women.
Throughout the history of art, there are innumerable examples of work where the attribution goes to the man, even though it was the woman who created it, for all sorts of reasons, many of them practical. The painting could be sold.
In reality, most fine arts museums tell a history of how men created the fine arts of the world. Most of the works in there are either by anonymous, who might have been a woman, I must say, or by men.
By the early 20th century, women everywhere were asserting their own artistic vision.
Georgia O'Keeffe is the most important American women painter of the 20th century. She was a quintessential modernist. She was told at one point that there was no such thing as women artists and that she would never get any recognition. And so she figured since she was never going to get any recognition, she might as well do what she wanted. and that may be key to her achievement.
A few years after Georgia O'Keeffe came the abstract expressionists. Many of the movement's greatest artists were women: Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, Elaine de Kooning, and Grace Hardigan. They honed their talents in the New York art scene of the 1950s.
Hardigan herself is an interesting character because she believed that a woman artist could not be seen properly by the critics if they saw her as being a woman. So she proffered herself as being George Hardigan and got a lot of good reviews.
At the other end of the spectrum are some of the great modern figurative artists, like Alice Neel.
We have a very good early example from a period when Neel was very socially conscious of a young Puerto Rican man who had just had several ribs removed because of tuberculosis. Audrey Flack is probably one of the best-known photorealist painters of the 1970s. We have a work called Hannah, Who She Is, and she loves her daughter dearly, and you can tell in this portrait how she puts her way above in the moon and the stars.
Many of the artists in the museum's collection are not household names.
One of the greatest things about working in contemporary art is that I feel that the museum and I personally can influence what is put in the history books next. We do a reasonable number of shows that are about contemporary artists here in the United States and contemporary artists who are international.
One such artist is the sculptor, Laurie Goulet. When her work was exhibited at the museum, like others before and since, it attracted national attention.
And by actually showcasing their work, you actually get an article in a paper, and that woman then is encoded into history because she's been written about.
In the 20th century, women artists have explored virtually every aspect of their world. Sometimes they have turned the sharpest light on themselves.
Alice Bailly, who was a Swiss painter, is one example of an artist you probably never heard of, but her story is very, very interesting. She was very much up on Cubism, the art of Picasso and Matisse. She knew a lot about that. We have a self-portrait of hers, which I like very much, because she's able to use abstract forms to develop her portrait, and you can see that she takes a very hard look at herself. She has a monocle. She doesn't necessarily think of herself as beautiful, but depicts herself instead as a strong artist.
In the Americas, another woman's striking self-portraits propelled her into the public eye.
One of the jewels in our collection is a painting called Self-Portrait dedicated to Leon Trotsky. It's by an artist named Frida Kahlo. She was an intense observer of herself, possibly narcissistic, totally self-involved. She probably brought a new dimension to the self-portrait.
She was married to Diego Rivera, the great muralist, Mexican muralist.
She had a brief affair with Trotsky, but more importantly, she was involved in the communist cause along with Rivera since the beginning.
This painting was given by Claire Booth Luce, and Mrs. Luce told me the story about it. She went to visit the studio of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. She had just finished this beautiful self-portrait.
She's dressed in a costume of a Mexican peasant, which identifies her with the Mexican Revolution and with communism.
In her hands is a tribute to Trotsky. And while Mrs. Luce was visiting, literally, the phone rang and it was news of his assassination. So Frida Kahlo became terribly upset. She grabbed a butcher knife and went over and said, "I'm going to kill myself." Symbolically, she started to slash the painting. And Mrs. Luce said, "No, no, no, you are going to sell it to me and I will keep it always in Trotsky's memory."
Through forms and images, sometimes stark, sometimes tender, sometimes familiar, and sometimes strange. Women have expressed their unique vision of the world. Over the centuries, that vision has moved steadily, if at times haltingly, into the artistic mainstream.
It's a very interesting problem as to how we look at whether there really are great women artists or not.
Actually, today, more than 50% of artists in our country are women.
the whole issue of what's great and what's not has really come under scrutiny over the last 20 years with the whole question of multiculturalism.
And it's changing. It's absolutely changing now.
How do you value certain art over others is a very important question. And how do you say that, let's say, Asian art isn't as wonderful as Western art? These questions are questions that were never asked 25 years ago.
Somehow, the moment has arrived when it seems to be all right to point out the accomplishments of women.
There are always going to be ebbs and flows. There will be periods where women gain more recognition, and hopefully there won't be too many more periods where women are somewhat eclipsed.
I think really what the museum is trying to do is to provide a forum so that this work can be shown, so that the public will be aware that there is a whole wonderful body of really beautiful work that women have contributed.
For my money, I think that there are great women artists.
Everybody who comes and sees us is pleased.
Learn more about America's great museums at greatmuseums.org. To order this episode or another, call 1-800-593-4420 or visit greatmuseums.org. Museums hold the treasures and tell the tales of the people and places that make America great. Funding for great museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.